a terrible person, Kate.
Sorry. This is like the live button on YouTube. Stress has been out. And we're live. It is Wednesday, August 18th, 5 o'clock on the dot, Eastern Time.
I just want to say Kate's ease of taking us live, which you can see in her smirk, she is lording over me, is a reflection of the fact that she sold her soul to Satan and he will collect it upon her death. But in the meantime, she sold it for a cheap price. Ease of going live on In Lieu of Fun, so I can lord it over Ben. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Ben is in Michigan, sitting by one of the Great Lakes.
Wait, this whole thing, I'm in an undisclosed location, dude.
Oh, did I fuck it up?
Yeah, you fucked it up. Sorry. Yes, I'm in an undisclosed location in Michigan along the coast of Lake Michigan. All right, now you've only got like 400 miles of coastline to work with.
Yes, exactly. It's still pretty undisclosed. We're not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to have Molly Crockett, PhD in neuroscience, professor of psychology at Yale University, friend of Kate Klonick, on the show today to talk about moral outrage and social media, and also to tell the story of how we met, which I think is like a pretty good origin story.
Totally. Should I tell the story?
Welcome
was that my cue to tell the
story? Yeah. How'd you meet Kate Klonick? Was there a live wild animal that required rescuing involved? And yeah, let's start there. What species of wild animal that required rescuing brought you together?
Well, I don't know about rescuing, but there was certainly a wild animal involved by the name of Cecil the lion, which some of you might have heard of, and is featured in a paper of Kate's that I came across. And I came across this paper during my first year as a professor of psychology at Yale. And one of the passion projects in my lab is understanding moral outrage in social media. And I published a really short paper on this in 2017. And then when looking for potential collaborators at the law school, came across Kate's paper that was a way more in-depth and smarter version of my paper that she had published in 2015 and that I wish I had come across earlier. And when I found it, I'm like, oh my God, I have to meet this person and talk to them about our mutual interests. And so I think I sent you an email and we made a plan to meet up at Maury's, which is this very like Yale place that involves a cappella singing. And I haven't been there a long time because COVID, but I just remember that conversation like sparking so many ideas, and we have started collaborating on some of those ideas, and we'll get to talking about those today. But I have no legal training. My knowledge of the law is extremely limited, but it's been so fun over the past couple of years starting to learn more about this space. And so I am super excited to talk to both of you and hear from your listeners about our recent work and what implications it might have for the regulation of online spaces, which is your jam. And yeah,
I'm gonna soup up this story, which was like basically we're sitting in Maury's and like Molly walks in, and I want to also say, like, I had no idea who Molly was. All I know is that, like, you contacted me and it says from MJ Crockett. So I actually didn't know, like, I think I remember I was like, I didn't know whether you were a woman or a man. So I just was like agreed to meet this person like, at Maury's. And I had literally no idea who I was looking for. And we were the only ones in there. And we sat down and like you kind of told me what you wanted to study and you told me your background, and I just kind of like I remember I was just like my eyes and like I remember like my heart racing, and I was like, this person is my person. I was like, this person is like, I was like oh
okay,
my
so
God.
Wait a minute, but for those of us who don't know the content in question, walk us through what were the Cecil the Lion online outrage papers that you both wrote that brought you together.
Yes. So Molly came in and was really interested. Her background is in neuroscience. As people on the show know, I have a background in neuroscience and cognitive science. And she was just really interested, basically. And one of the things is that like my background is like kind of self-taught. Like I didn't go to graduate school for social science. Well, I did, but for professional science, I guess you would say, and law. And I had like a touch of like, I have a knowledge of how to read really deeply, like empirical papers. I have like ideas for experiments, but like I myself do not have the time, energy, resources, or know-how to basically come up with empirical projects to test empirically a lot of like the things that I think happen in social reactions to the internet and kind of moral intuitions about the internet or law. And so kind of like Molly walked in and she was like, I read your paper on online shaming. And this was about Cecil Lyon. So this was about, I'm telling you.
Go back, tell us about the paper.
Yeah, I'm telling you about the paper. But so like the paper was basically a paper that was about how law treated shaming. So shaming generally is thought to be kind of the internal and person's like, an external response by people when there is some type of norm violation. Guilt, by contrast, is an internal infliction of kind of like norm of like kind of feeling bad and punishing yourself when you feel like you violated some type of norm. Whereas like shaming is like what we as a society kind of individual and then collectively kind of do when there's been a norm violation. So this is kind of interesting for the law because in theory, and there was a period in like the 1990s when a bunch of like very hoity-toity fancy pants professors of law like got this idea of shaming and were like, how can we utilize this to use norms to enforce behavior, and like instead of using the law and prisons and fines and locking people up. And this turned out to be a terrible idea because shaming, for a lot of reasons, has no boundaries. It's hard to rein back in. It's hard to control. It's, just by definition. But nevertheless, like so this paper had taken that kind of body of work that had looked at shaming as kind of as a alternative to imprisonment for nonviolent crimes. And then it had kind of put together like the internet, and this was before the internet was big, that had happened in the 90s. And then I had added like, well, now we have the internet. What is going on when someone violates a norm? How is shaming being used? And one of those examples was the Cecil the Lion story. So Cecil the Lion was the dentist, Arnold Palmer. It's not Arnold Palmer, it's Walter Palmer. I always say.
That's a good drink though.
I know. Walter Palmer was this dentist who'd gone to Africa. He had shot this beloved and very old legendary lion on this kind of reserve, and he had posted pictures of it to social media, and this had set off this massive bout of shaming. I think he lived in Minnesota, and like people went to his
Radio
house.
Lab episode, by the way, about
I think I'm in that Radio Lab episode.
Not this incident, but a very similar incident involving a black rhino.
Yeah. So basically, I used that incident and a couple of other slightly different, but kind of like one variable off, I would say, episodes to kind of show all of the different kind of valences of shaming, why the internet made it kind of unhinged. Now it's kind of commonsensical, but at the time, like not a lot of people were looking at it. And so I think that this was like, 2016, 2017 that you contacted me. So it was only like a year old, the paper. And so Molly basically was like interested in that exact kind of phenomenon. But instead of doing kind of this qualitative thing, which I had done, which was describe all these stories and kind of use words to describe what had happened to them, you wanted to do like a more rigorous kind of like empirical thing of like, let's look at it in bulk. Let's look how like outrage travels. Let's look about how we impose norms and morals on other people on the internet. And so we had this meeting, and it was just like,
wait. Really, before we get to the meeting, Molly, tell me about your paper and your discovery of Kate's paper and why you sought the meeting.
Yes. Okay. So this was a paper that I published in 2017, and while Kate's paper is focusing on, would it be correct to say like normative questions around like, how the law really ought to treat shaming and how that might live in the age of the internet. I was coming from a descriptive place where I wanted to understand how the brain's reward system, and in particular the capacity to learn from rewards, might have a side effect of amplifying moral outrage online, because it had already become very clear by 2016, 2017, when I was working on my first paper in this space, that expressions of emotions and moral emotions in particular are particularly likely to go viral online. And so my collaborator, Billy Brady, showed in 2017 that when you express moral emotions online, you get a ton of likes and retweets. And that, of course, is reinforcing. So if you just take the basic biological fact of reinforcement learning, which is that if you reward a behavior, it becomes more likely in the future, just because it has been rewarded, then you create a situation where if algorithms are amplifying engaging content, a lot of which happens to be moral outrage, and the individuals who express that outrage are getting disproportionate levels of likes and retweets, those social rewards, because the algorithm is, exposing them to more people, then that could increase the propensity of individuals to express more outrage over time. Not necessarily because they actually feel more outrage, but because it's getting rewarded.
Yeah.
So that was a paper that I had written, and I was really interested in the sort of potential implications for the law and for policy, but I don't have expertise in that space. So I was looking on the Yale Information Society Project website and came across the description of Kate's research, and then I found the paper, like, oh my God, like this is the person who I want to talk to about this.
So does that make more sense now, Ben?
Indeed, but I have a follow-up question. So walk us through the Cecil the Lion online response, which was, for those of you too young to remember it, Paula, a ferocious, anger directed at this guy who had bought a essentially license to kill this lion on a I believe Zimbabwean reservation. How does this fit into the theories that you're developing about online outrage?
Do you want me to go, Mal, or do you want me, or you want to go?
I'm not quite sure how to answer this question, because Cecil the Lion is a wild animal, so that's why I use the example, because you were asking, I think, in jest about. But I wouldn't use that as the central example necessarily for illustrating this phenomenon. And one thing I do.
Okay. Sorry. So I took your joke serious.
Oh no,
I took your joke seriously.
It's fine.
So what are the? So walk us through a sort of more central example, animate or not, named Cecil or not, that represents the kind of thing that you're talking about.
I don't know. Do you want to take that, Kate? I mean, I like the sort of the example that comes to mind the most, like probably Justine Sacco is a poster child for this kind of thing.
So we can describe Justine Sacco. So people probably have heard about this. Again, there was a Radio Lab about it. There was also, it was the center, I think there was This American Life about it. It was the center of John Ronson's book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed. And the story of Justine Sacco is really interesting, and kind of, I did talk about it in the paper. The story is that she is this woman who is in PR for, this is kind of like, that is a slightly important valence, because some of these things it's hard to like kind of create a classifier for these things, and we'll talk about what that means in a second. But like Justine Sacco is a young white woman in New Jersey working for some big conglomerate in PR or something like that. And she has like 100 Twitter followers, but her account is open and public. And she tweets as she gets on a plane to go to South Africa from New York, on my way to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS. Just kidding. What am I talking about? I'm white, or something like that. Like, that was basically, like, that was the gist of the tweet. This tweet gets sent to someone, sends this to Sam Biddle, who is a reporter at Gawker at the time, which still existed. And Sam Biddle basically just makes a Gawker post that says, really great PR job, basically, like, and puts the, like, and embeds the tweet, like, on the front page of Gawker. And people go ape shit. Like, people just go completely nuts. So she is, I want to just, like, emphasize, like, this is a couple, like, an hour after she's tweeted this. She's on a plane. It is taken off. It's a 13-hour flight or something, like 8-hour flight, something very long to get to South Africa. In the time that the flight is in the air, she is fired from her job. She is, like, condemned by, like, many politicians, like, people and public figures in Africa and AIDS. And doing AIDS research and work. She gets to South Africa and finds all of this out, and there are people who are waiting at the airport. They have created a hashtag to be able to talk to each other, that are waiting at the airport to publicly, like, approach her and yell at her and berate her for what she's, like, said. And this, I mean, basically the story goes that she just, like, never really recovers from this. Her career doesn't recover. Like, she loses her job. She has, like, a long time finding a new one. Every time you Google her name, this is, like, the first thing that comes up. So she has to kind of reinvent her entire life. And the reason that we use this as kind of a proxy is that if you think about norms as these soft, kind of, like, morally intoned or morally valenced in some type of way, and this is, like, where they become what is moral and what is normative. It's, like, a hard line to like determine, and you can, Molly, talk more about that, but, like, the general thing is just, like, there are a couple of things that the internet takes away from normal conceptions of shaming that I think are good to talk about, which is, like, in the day of the Scarlet Letter, right? If you were going to shame Hester Prynne, you had to, like, and she was in the stockade, you had to physically walk to the stockade and take time out of your day to, like, walk there and yell at her. You had to use your own face to do that. Like, you had to use yourself and your body to, like, go and shame her. So other people saw you shaming her. And if some point in the future it turns out that she didn't do something bad or something else, maybe you would be seen as wrongfully shaming her or something like that. So, like, that was a part of it. It takes energy. So, like, there's kind of it. So it's not costless. And, like, all of these things, and it's infinite. I should also say that like, the ability to do this kind of lives forever. And none of these things exist online. The ability to do this is time subscribed, but online it's infinite. And so all of these things are completely changed online. All of these frictions are completely eviscerated. And so shame travels much faster. It becomes expressive to other people of other types of things, which is kind of what Molly has ended up kind of looking at a lot with the moral outrage work. And so to kind of test these types of ideas and how empirically this happens, Molly built, and her lab built, like, what's called a classifier. So Molly, do you want to talk about the classifier?
Yeah, and before I do that, I just want to highlight a really important distinction in this line of work. And actually, there's some really wonderful comments and debates happening in the chat that illustrate this really well. I think that the goal of both Kate's research in this space and my research in this space is not to answer the question, was it right or wrong that Justine Sacco suffered the consequences that she did? Like, there are a variety of opinions on that I can see in the chat. I think what's really fascinating about this question is that this is a new phenomenon. Moral outrage, shaming, and punishment have been around as long as civilization, and there's even some debate of whether, like, the precursors of those emotions and behaviors can be seen in our non-human primate relatives, right? But, like, the scale of it and the way that it unfolds is fundamentally different with the advent of online social networks. And those facts of how it's different, I think, have really important normative implications, right? So our contribution is to test some of the assumptions that we might have about the propagation of online outrage through social networks, and indeed how individuals in those networks decide to express outrage. But as Kate mentioned, in order to be able to study moral outrage on the internet, you have to be able to measure it. And it turns out it took us like 3 years to build the tools to do that. But now that we have that tool, it opens up a lot of possibilities for doing a lot of really cool observational studies combined with lab studies.
So why don't you start by describing the tool, what it can measure, and what you're using it for?
Exactly. So this work was led by Billy Brady, a postdoc in my lab, along with Killian McLaughlin, who's a PhD student, and Tuan Nguyen, who was Duan, who is an undergrad at Yale in the data science program, and now is working in the tech industry. And what we basically do is we take out of the box machine learning methods. We ended up using a deep neural net combined with theory from social psychology about what moral outrage is. So we take a very large set of tweets, 26,000, that we had gathered from Twitter during online shaming or not shaming, episodes of public outrage. Most of those were political outrage. So we had the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, we had Trump's transgender ban in the military, we had the Covington Catholic high school students incident in Washington, D.C. We had the Jussie Smollett hate crime claiming incident. And we had one episode of non-political outrage, the United Airlines viral video when the passenger refused to get off the flight and was...
and they beat him.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Everyone loves to hate on United Airlines. That is universal.
I have to say, when I watched that video, they can't give you water more than every 2 hours, but if you pay the right cost, they can beat you. I thought the outrage against United was well deserved and only prompted by the video, not actually a response to it.
Exactly. So we selected these incidents because there were a lot of tweets about them, and we expected there to be a high prevalence of moral outrage in those tweets. And then we need to get labels for those tweets to train the classifier, because of course not every tweet in these data sets is going to express outrage, and we need to be able to feed our software a big bucket of tweets and have it make predictions, essentially the likelihood that a human coder would label that tweet as indeed containing outrage or not. And so we had a group of annotators, these were volunteers, go through each tweet by hand and say whether it has outrage or not. And then we take a sort of majority rule. So we show each tweet to around 10 annotators, and then if a majority of them say that it's outrage, then that tweet gets labeled as outrage, and then we use that to train our classifier. The criteria that we gave to the annotators comes from social psychological theory, and essentially the definition that we use is a tweet contains outrage if the expression references feelings that people have in response to a perceived violation of their personal moral standards. That's the first point. Those feelings include emotions like anger, disgust, and contempt. And then the third point is that those feelings are associated with specific types of reactions that people want to see happen, like blame, holding them responsible, wanting to see them be punished. So we have now this data set of labeled tweets, and we run it through our machine learning algorithms. And what we have now is software that is freely available on the internet to researchers who want to use this in their research. And it's linked in our paper. And it does pretty well at a sample. So we're getting, reasonably high accuracy levels for the tweets. I would need to look up the exact number, but it's sort of between 70 and 80% is what we typically see accuracy, which is about as good as social media companies themselves are getting in terms of their prediction scores for anything that's a complex human emotion, right? So we feel pretty proud of our little ragtag team of three getting scores that Facebook and Twitter have dozens of engineers working on full time.
No, it's awesome. So we've talked about so both of us are typically, I think that both of our previous work has been like really around descriptive, like describing what's happening, and that's definitely what this classifier in this paper is about.
Yeah.
But kind of in your wildest dreams, or like in the immediate future, how do you think this research is useful to kind of the problem of shaming online, or the issues associated with kind of moral outrage that we kind of frequently talk about?
Well, I think in the immediate future, I see two useful applications. The first is just being able to address, like, to ask questions like the one that we asked in our paper, which is, if you get more likes or retweets for expressing outrage in a tweet, do you then become more likely over time to express outrage? And we do find that. And we find that effect is particularly strong for users who are in politically moderate social networks. So we can use other tools to measure the political ideology of social networks online. And what's really interesting is if you're in a network with a lot of ideologically extreme folks, there's going to be a lot of outrage around, and you're going to follow the crowd and express outrage too, but you're going to be less sensitive to how much reward you get, because you're more just sort of shaping your behavior, you're conforming to the crowd. But if you're in a network where there's less outrage, you're actually more sensitive to the direct rewards that you are getting for expressing outrage. So it seems like in moderate networks, folks are especially sensitive to the reinforcement side of the platform.
So when the case of like Jussie Smollett or the Covington boys, in both of those instances, what's kind of interesting about them descriptively is that they started as one type of story, where you thought one type of thing was happening. Like liberals thought that like these anti-Trump boys were like, or the pro-Trump MAGA boys were coming and shaming a Native American, and then like over the next couple of hours more came out. In the Jussie Smollett case, you have a black man who's claiming that like a bunch of people beat him up and called him a bunch of terrible things, and then that turns out that he's faking it. Were you able to measure over time the shift of like, is there a backlash for people that like were super morally outraged to begin with, or can they just like hop on the next bandwagon or something? Like, how does it work?
That's a great question, and we haven't looked at the dynamics over time at the crowd level, but that's certainly something we're really interested in. I think that the main takeaway for me, aside from just being able to answer scientific questions, and again, a question I get asked a lot is like, oh, so like, should we use this tool to just like turn down all the outrage in the feed? And I don't know if, like, I really want to be clear in making the point that like moral outrage on the internet itself is not inherently a good thing or a bad thing. It really depends on the context. And moral outrage is a really powerful tool that social movements can use to change public opinion, to enact changes over time. But it also, as we have seen over the past few years, can be used to motivate a lot of really ugly stuff and actions that are threatening to democracy. So it's not a straightforward question whether like moral outrage online is a problem in and of itself. It's really the context that matters. And I think that for me, what I would love to hear your thoughts on in the sort of content moderation and tech policy space, social media platforms have been claiming since the beginning, and they continue to claim that, oh, we're just like a telephone line, like we're a conduit or a mirror for conversations that people would otherwise already be having, and now they can just have those same conversations that they would have offline with more people. And I think that our data shows definitively that this is just not true, even though this is a very obvious insight from psychology. Like, as soon as you have engagement-based newsfeed algorithms, you are rewarding particular types of expressions on that environment. So it would be like, if on this video call, every time the topic steers to a particular topic, we would get like a little electric shock or a little dopamine jolt in our brain. And so like the platform itself and the incentives that are been built into that are shaping the content of people's expressions online over time.
But doesn't it matter what you're expressing moral outrage about? For example, if, say, 20 million women and girls in Afghanistan are suddenly at risk of, terrible, terrible things,
right,
and you express moral outrage about that, that seems like a wholly defensible response to a set of true facts.
Yes.
Or at least to a set of anxieties that are driven by true facts, i.e., it is true that the Taliban is now in control of Afghanistan. It is true that the Taliban has oppressed women and girls in a fashion that is as brutal as it is fanatical, and it is therefore reasonable to be anxious that that will happen in the future and to be morally outraged at that possibility. And to whatever extent one feels this way, as I do, at the U.S. role in allowing this to happen, if it in fact does happen. That strikes me as one kind of moral outrage. Another kind of moral outrage is, and I think it would measure the same on a moral outrage scale, but it wouldn't and shouldn't measure the same on a content moderation scale, is like Bill Gates wants to inject a tracking device into my veins using the vaccine, the so-called vaccine, as a pretext. And I'm outraged that this isn't about public health. It's all about, and just for the Liz Wheelers out there who are going to quote me saying this, I'm not speaking in my own voice here. I'm speaking in the voice of, people like you. People are like, I'm morally outraged that the society is forcing me to do this, right?
Exactly.
And so then you have moral outrage that is built upon layers and layers of falsehood.
Yes.
And it strikes me that those are rather different rather different public policy problems.
Yes.
But they're not different on the outrage scale of 1 to 10. So how do we deal with the cognitive difference between moral outrage that is, leave aside the question of whether it's justified, it's predicated on factual truth. Some people can be outraged by, Cecil the lion, but that is a true thing. That some dentist in Minnesota did buy a license to shoot Cecil the lion, did shoot him, did post and stuff. Whether it's worth the degree of outrage, it's not a different question. I'm outraged by the Taliban and women. And some people are outraged by, the 5G network planting stuff in their brains. From an outrage perspective, they're all the same. From a public policy perspective, they're rather different. So talk me through that and how you handle it if you do.
That is such a great question. You've really hit the nail on the head, I think, which is that You're absolutely right. There is outrage that's grounded in reality, and there's outrage that's grounded in dis or misinformation. And the mechanisms that we identify, the social reinforcement of outrage, doesn't care, doesn't distinguish between the two. And that's what we're concerned about. At the same time that you have, outrage about a reality-based, event of public concern getting reinforced by social feedback, you also at the same time have what you might call misguided outrage that is getting amplified and reinforced through the exact same processes. And we even have some preliminary evidence to suggest that disinformation is really engineered to trigger outrage because it's more likely to go viral and spread. So one project that we have been doing and is in the pipeline is asking the question, does disinformation attract more outrage than information that is from legitimate news sources? And can we see whether outrage contributes to the spread of disinformation online? And so far, our results suggest that our hunch is unfortunately correct, that the types of processes that we identify with the fact of viral outrage certainly seems to be at play in the spread of false information.
So I want to say something kind of interesting, which is like, yes, there are kind of, we gave some Cecil the Lion examples. We have like the Covington boys that are like, the liberal outrage at that was misplaced. Same with the Jussie Smollett. So there's questions of it being misplaced. But to Ben's question of like when it's righteous, when the moral outrage is correct, I think that like one of the descriptive questions that would be interesting to say, once you can discern, if you could discern between those two, and I actually kind of wonder if you can, like I don't know that you necessarily could based on everything you just said, and just I don't know. I think that it's a very subjective kind of determination. But would you, if you could wave a wand and change something about how the algorithms work, Molly, like what do you think that you would change?
Oh gosh, what a great question. Yeah, I like if you could wave a wand and distinguish between outrage motivated by here's one idea. We know that some outrage is really strategic and deliberative, and you could imagine someone scrolling through social media, reading about what's happening in Afghanistan, feeling really upset about it, thinking this is wrong, sitting and contemplating and deciding in a really intentional, deliberate way, I think this is wrong. I want to add my voice to the conversation online and say that I think this is wrong and why. And there is outrage in that expression that comes from a place of intention and deliberation. And you could imagine, another type of outrage that is knee-jerk. I see a headline, I don't even bother to read the article or check whether the information is reliable. It just triggers something in me that is, a knee-jerk reaction, and I express outrage, but maybe it's not well-informed or coming from an intentional place. And I don't honestly know whether those psychological processes would be detectable in language, but if they were, and I could build a classifier to detect between those two, then you could imagine public good coming from tamping down the unintentional knee-jerk kind of outrage while preserving the intentional outrage.
Yeah, totally. I think that seems right. I'm bringing in audience members just so this is like to ask questions, and we're going to start with Mike Larkey, who asked a question that actually like 2 or 3 people posed, which I guess is, oh no, I'm having trouble making him reappear. Oh man. Okay, Mike, we're gonna bring you out and have you come back in again. But in the meantime, we'll have Ave ask her question. Ave, so nice to see you.
Yes, nice to see you too. Actually,
are you in the? Oh wait, are you in the outside the RV office?
Absolutely, yeah. I just changed background since I have like kind of more professional meeting this morning, and I didn't want to be in front of the van, so I decided that trees would be better than a vintage van.
And being British Columbia, the trees are unbelievably tall.
There are, yeah.
It is amazing. All right, yeah. I've distracted you enough.
No worries. Yeah, so I'm asking a question about the algorithm, which I'm always kind of anxious about since like lots of bad stuff are asked, but I'll ask it anyway. Do we know if the algorithm deciding the post that should be amplified uses classifiers of the one you develop, like to see really like, okay, this is moral outrage, I will promote it? Or is it just like, oh, moral outrage, more retweets, more stuff, then it goes higher? So
I don't actually know the answer to your question because social media platforms don't release the secret sauce behind their algorithms. I don't think that outrage is specifically being optimized by newsfeed algorithms. I think it's a more generic metric of just engagement and what users are likely to click on and engage with in their feed, and then that kind of information gets promoted over time. It just so happens that outrage is like one of the most engaging things because it has a really adaptive value for us. Like, it's really, really important that we know what people in our social group think is right or wrong so that we don't do those things.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think that it's not like they set out to like specifically be like, let's target outrage. I think it's that outrage is a proxy often for engagement, and engagement is what they target. And so sometimes that is positive and sometimes that is negative, but you can at least in a small sense like split it off as outrage, and that is kind of useful. But speaking of outrage, we have Mike's question. Go ahead, Mike. Nice to see you.
Hi. Thanks for having me. So my first question when we started talking about this is, what makes outrage moral as opposed to some other kind of outrage? Are there other kinds of outrage? If someone doesn't want to get vaccinated, is it moral because they're like endangering others, or is it just practical because you're being endangered? Does it co-occur with other kinds of outrage? What is the moral outrage of it exactly?
Yeah, I also will just like ask that kind of, I think that there was also a request in the questions, but from Daniel, but he's like disappeared, but basically to define what makes something like moral outrage versus other types of things.
Yeah. So the definition that we used to develop our classifier and to do our research comes from social psychology. And that's basically, it's defined by the moral values of the person expressing it. So, and this is a really important point, I think, because I, as a liberal, wouldn't feel outraged about something that a conservative would feel outraged about, but I can recognize moral outrage in a conservative. I can understand that they have a set of moral values, even though they're different from mine. And if those values are violated in their eyes, then they would feel outrage. And likewise, if I believe that someone or something has, violated a norm that I hold dear, I would feel outraged about that and have emotions like anger, disgust, contempt. Those emotions can also occur outside the context of a moral violation. But that's how we define it.
Yeah, so to kind of like follow up on Mike's question, and this is something that I've always struggled with, and I think actually Josh Knob was on the show a couple of weeks ago. And so we talked about it with him when he was talking about some of his research. But like, what is the difference between morals and norms? I mean, like, not colloquially, but like in how you specifically study them. I mean, I think that people...
One is what we type in the chat with an exclamation mark, and the other isn't. That's the difference.
Yeah, I know. There's a joke about norms on the show, Molly, because I say it all the time, and I'm constantly talking about it, so people make fun of me. But go ahead.
Well, so in psychology, we distinguish between descriptive norms, which is like what most people are doing, and prescriptive norms, which is what most people think others ought to do. And it's those prescriptive norms that are more closely tied to morality. And you could think of morality as comprising a system of prescriptive norms. Sometimes people also refer to proscriptive norms, like what you should do and shouldn't do, right? So that's how I think about the relationship.
Yeah, that's actually a really good way to kind of think of it. And on top of all of that, I would say is law, which is kind of like an actual kind of formalizing of like some of those ideas into kind of something that is like you're allowed to do or not allowed to do.
But law has a much more complicated relationship with morality than norms do, I think.
Because law does with norms?
Well, yeah, there are some laws that are that don't reflect anything about the way what the society that enacts them regards as moral. They are simply codifications of what works to make things work better. For example, when there's a traffic light that says, you have to stop at the red light, there's no moral code that says,
yes,
hey, you have to give somebody else the chance to cross the street. There's merely a sense that the society will work better. And then there are these regulatory laws, and Crime a Day, of course, has a field day making fun of these. But there are these regulatory rules that have no moral content at all. They're just embodiments of something that makes, and we think of these as particularly irrational because they carry criminal penalties, which we associate with moral sanction. But in fact, the regulatory environment is replete with stuff that we attach no moral value to at all. Whereas I think norms do tend to track more closely with expected human behavior that's based in some way on a kind of understanding of the way we treat each other that's rooted more in morality.
I mean, I think that, sorry if I'm going to answer for you, Molly, but I think that like what Molly is saying about descriptive norms versus prescriptive norms kind of gets at that. Prescriptive norms are more rooted in morality, whereas descriptive norms are like, we go up, like we walk, when we're going up and down stairs, you stay to the right. Like there's nothing more morally inflective about like staying to the right, other than don't be a fucking asshole and walk on the left. Although that is, like, but like there's nothing like kind of that rule is
But there are rules that are, so that one you could say is based in courtesy, right? That if you don't walk, if everybody walks on the right, or if everybody walks on the right, fewer people will block each other, fewer people will bump into each other, there'll be less, unintended incidents of people dropping their stuff, or less opportunity for groping, all kinds of things that aren't like, just less opportunity for human friction. So it's polite if everybody follows that norm. There are laws that have zero moral content, like you shall not appropriate the image of the Swiss coat of arms. There is a criminal law that says that. Now, we attach zero moral sanction to using the Red Cross thing. But there's the Smokey the Bear logo, ditto. Criminal law on that point. You can't say these are embodiments of some moral code. On the other hand, most norms reflect some sense of how we should treat each other.
Well, moral norms do certainly, but I think there are descriptive norms that don't have moral content. So I think these are orthogonal dimensions we're talking about here. At least the way we talk about norms in psychology, you have descriptive versus pre-proscriptive, which is the contrast between how people actually are and people's beliefs about how we ought to be on the one hand, and then in descriptive land, how people actually are. Quite a lot of actual behavior follows what people think is right or wrong. So like, most people don't go around smacking people's face, and then that is illegal. But also,
or like, appropriating the Swiss coat of arms.
But plenty of descriptive norms, like, you know, we wear a particular kind of clothes to the office versus at home, have no moral content, and I think this past year has been a great example of like how non-moral norms can shift over time. But one question that I'm really fascinated in lately is sort of the blurry lines between norms that are like very clearly moral and norms that many people would think are arbitrary but do get moralized. So we could have a whole separate episode on that.
Actually, like, it's funny that you mentioned like the being like told to wear something to the office, because if something like, I don't think about that, like I don't feel like some type of moral, but it would become valenced in kind of like my liberty or my freedom if someone decided to suddenly pass a law that said that I had to wear something specifically to the office versus at home, like, right? So is that kind of what you're talking about, is like how like kind of our relationship with some type of idea changes, like from a moral perspective, like if it's taken away or regulated?
Yeah, that's one angle. That's one angle of it. But I think there's also just an interesting set of questions around like, if you were to show up at your office wearing pajamas, like probably some people would judge you harshly, and you might even suffer consequences in your job for doing that, when other people might not bat an eye. And so there's this like interesting kind of gray area between like norms that we follow because there are obvious welfare consequences for other people, and norms that we follow just because like there's a tradition to do that, and like we've always done it this way, and so if you do it a different way, you're seen as weird and deviant. And like, I think the human mind just blurs the line between deviant and bad, and it's worth asking, like, are there instances of that we should be re-examining?
I love that.
I want to propose one right here, where the human mind, our norms tolerate a lie, and it's not considered lying, but it's clearly untrue, and I don't think we should be tolerating it. So all the time, people text at me, LOL, when they did not, in fact, laugh out loud. And I hate that. I feel like I have a reliance.
This is my hobby horse. You are not allowed to steal this.
I've been on this hobby horse forever. Since like before you were born. I hate it when people LOL me when they're not. And I'm glad you're recently on this case, Kate Flonick. But like, it's the norm is it's perfectly okay to lie to people and tell them you laughed out loud.
My favorite thing to do is call people out on this. Like if I'm like texting them and we're in a call right now, and I texted Molly and she texted back LOL, I'd be like, fuck you, you're not laughing. Like, you're not laughing.
Please don't take LOL away from me.
I mean, I believe I LOL somebody when and only when I actually laughed out loud, because I feel like they are entitled, when I say laugh out loud, to take it at face value. That is a norm. I feel moral outrage about it every time I get an LOL when I don't know. Is Genevieve De La Fera actually laugh out loud? I don't know what. Usually, I don't know where I stand. And it's terrible.
I have to say very quickly, we have to introduce you to Genevieve. This is Genevieve. She is also a co-host on In Lieu of Fun. She's a former student of mine at St. John's Law School, and but she has the next question for you. And yeah, go ahead, Genevieve. Ask whatever you want. You don't have to stick to any of your questions.
Oh, okay. Well, also, in defense of LOL, signaling is different than norms. So just separating that.
That is true.
Signaling, yeah. But
yeah, maybe it's not an act. Yeah, that's true.
But that's for another day. My question is, though, do you think that the outrage amplification problem that we're kind of dealing with is burdened by the size of the communities, like online, that we're now dealing with? Because if you think about like the Salem witch trials as like a comparator, that was very closeted to like a very distinct community.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one of the concerns, and I'm going to deliberately use the word concern rather than problem about moral outrage online, is the scale of it. And, you know, I think there are a lot of cases now where, you know, many people, if not all people, would be worried about the fact that a tweet intended for a particular audience can be transmitted to a different audience, and there can be disproportionate punishment. So the scale of the response is just like really not something we have a lot of control over once it gets on the internet. And then of course, once it's on the internet, it lives forever. And this is particularly salient in the cases of young people who are involved in online shaming episodes. And I think the balance that we have to find with online moral outrage is, on the one hand, it just can be an incredibly powerful tool for collectives to communicate how they think the world ought to be. And I think there are a lot of positive examples that we've seen over the last year, especially around race and gender, where this has been happening. But at the same time, we have to balance that against the need for individuals to be able to learn and change and grow over time. And because internet is forever, especially with young people who are, you know, finding their way in the world with respect to their values, you know, I worry about, you know, lasting reputational consequences for kids who are still figuring it all out.
Well, I think that that's like a pretty good place to leave it. We put a link to Molly's paper in the chat. I will do it one more time. Hopefully, yep, there you go. And in the meantime, I don't know. I think that next classifier has to go on LOL, and then actual LOL, and then like ROFL, and then
no. Wait, the actual part is the out loud. It's the OL. Otherwise, you could just use L. It's laughing. The part where you saying it's out loud when it's not.
But it's so unbalanced in text.
Yeah, I don't understand. What about like, okay, so there's,
how about
just really quickly, there's
CTS, chuckles to self. That's what you mean.
So Ben, are you proposing a ban on LMAO? Because there's never a time where that could be grounded in reality. I hope.
Yeah, I think because there is never a time, it is clearly hyperbole. So it doesn't leave you wondering as a recipient, is she really? Like,
okay,
because I feel like if I send somebody a text and it makes them burst out laughing, that's a win. I like did something that day. And I always like, and when somebody says LOL, I'm always like, I wonder if that text was really that good. And it just drives me bananas that people use it casually. It seems to me LOL should be high praise.
It is actually kind of interesting, though, like how, I mean, sometimes I actually do LOL, but then I now add the actually LOLing. And then, like, so.
Yeah, you're pretty good about it.
But also I laugh at everything. So, you know,
well,
I'm just like an easy mark.
I feel very safe because I'm usually laughing.
Yeah, exactly. You are always laughing. Exactly. Just be like a very good-spirited person, and then you won't be lying about LOL. I
think a lot of people use LOL just like,
They do. They use it like, haha.
It's terrible.
And because ha 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 and heh sound really like have very different valences. They're all signaling different things. Like heh is like a snarky, and then like ha 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 is like, depending on how many ha's. Like if you do like 20 of them, then it's kind of an equivalent to an LOL. But right, and then like the new thing where
although
you
it takes
like,
longer.
and then I feel like the lowest though is like the whole like the little
eyes.
button. No, the button that you can press on a text message, and then you get like a thing, and you can type ha ha in like it can like like whatever they call that when you can recognize the text with some type of like in message emoji
that's
just like ha ha. Yeah, like no, that it just like attaches on the edge of the
I think we should create a that's funny for things that are mildly amusing or I'm amused, that people can use instead of LOL, so we can preserve LOL for the situations where people actually laugh out loud. It's you know, it's not too much to ask. We will be back really tomorrow. Digressed. Molly Crockett, you're a great American. You have filled us all with moral outrage. We're all going to go express it on the internet, directed at a random stranger who probably doesn't deserve it. We will be back tomorrow with Tim Miller, because somebody reminded me the other day that it had been a long time since Tim Miller was on the show.
You reminded you of that. Genevieve is laughing because she was on the text chain, and it was you that reminded you of Tim Miller.
Somebody who was me reminded me that it had been a while since Tim Miller had been on the show, and it had been a while since Sarah Longwell was on the show. So I sent them both a text that said, who's available? And Tim responded and Sarah didn't. So you're going to have to wait for the Friday for the French Village podcast to hear from Sarah. But you can hear from Tim tomorrow, 22 hours and 59 minutes from now. And until then, Genevieve?
We don't have fun anymore, but we have signaling, moral outrage, and norms that we should listen to.
Yeah. Okay. See you guys later.